The wealthy widow's bank account dwindled day by day as her private nurse executed the perfect crime. Sarah had planned it meticulously, gained trust, access accounts, and slowly drain the fortune of an elderly woman too weak to notice. With millions already secured, she dreamed of the lavish new life awaiting her. But Sarah had made a fatal mistake in choosing her victim. Behind Margaret Chen's fragile exterior lay a razor-sharp mind, hidden connections, and decades of hard-earned wisdom. Now, as her supposed caretaker celebrated victory, Margaret was carefully laying a trap that would teach Sarah the most brutal lesson of her life: never underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Victorian mansion on Maple Grove stood as a testament to the Chen family's success, its meticulously maintained gardens reflecting decades of careful attention. Inside, Margaret Chen sat in her late husband's study, surrounded by the remnants of their shared life. Award plaques from their import business, photos of international travels, and the antique desk where they'd built their empire together. 3 months after Robert's passing, Margaret's arthritis had worsened significantly. The grief manifested in her joints, making even the simplest tasks challenging. Her daughter Emily had suggested a live-in nurse, but their strained relationship made Margaret hesitant to accept help through that channel. Instead, she contacted Premier Care Services, determined to maintain her independence. The agency sent 5 candidates. 4 were dismissed within minutes, too eager, too distracted, too familiar. But Sarah Williams was different. Her credentials were impeccable: top of her class at nursing school, spotless employment record, and glowing references from wealthy families across the state. She carried herself with quiet confidence, answering questions precisely while maintaining professional distance. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah had said during the interview, "I understand the delicate nature of this position. You need someone who respects boundaries while providing attentive care." Her tone was perfectly modulated, her navy blue suit crisp and professional. Margaret noted how Sarah's eyes never lingered too long on the antiques or artwork. Other candidates had practically appraised the house during their interviews, but Sarah maintained focus on their conversation. It was this detail that ultimately swayed Margaret's decision. The paperwork was completed within a week. Sarah moved into the guest house, establishing a routine that seemed to anticipate Margaret's every need. Morning medications were always on time, meals were prepared to perfection, and the house maintained its immaculate order. Margaret's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Rivera, expressed concerns once. "There's something too perfect about her, Senora," she'd whispered while dusting the library shelves. But Margaret dismissed these worries as simple jealousy over shared duties. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah's presence became increasingly invaluable. She handled Margaret's correspondence, scheduled medical appointments, and even began assisting with basic financial tasks: paying utility bills, managing household accounts, ordering supplies. Each responsibility was surrendered gradually. Naturally, as Margaret's trust in her nurse grew, the first time Sarah suggested helping with online banking, it seemed perfectly reasonable. Margaret's hands were particularly stiff that day, the computer mouse unwieldy in her grip. "Let me take care of that for you, Mrs. Chen," Sarah offered, her voice gentle. "You should rest those joints." In the growing darkness of winter afternoons, Margaret often found herself dozing in her favorite armchair, while Sarah worked efficiently in the background. The soft click of computer keys became a lullaby, masking the sound of a fortune beginning to slip away, one careful transaction at a time. By spring, Sarah had woven herself so thoroughly into the fabric of Margaret's life that even Richard Zhang, Margaret's friend of 40 years and personal attorney, began consulting her about his clients' needs. Sarah attended every meeting, her notebook open, pen poised to record important details. Her presence had become as natural as breathing. "Margaret's lucky to have you," Richard said one afternoon, gathering his papers after their quarterly financial review. I haven't seen her this well cared for since Robert was alive. Sarah accepted the compliment with practiced humility, her eyes downcast, hands folded neatly in her lap. What Richard couldn't see was how Sarah had orchestrated each interaction. The coffee served at precisely the right temperature, Margaret's medication timed to keep her alert yet comfortable during meetings, the subtle ways Sarah guided conversations away from too detailed financial discussions. She was building a fortress of trust, brick by careful brick. During their private moments, Sarah drew out stories of Margaret's past. She learned of the young immigrant who'd arrived in America with nothing but determination, who'd built an import-export empire alongside her husband, who'd outmaneuvered countless businessmen who underestimated her. Margaret rarely spoke of these things to anyone else, but Sarah's attentiveness made her an ideal audience. "You remind me of myself at your age," Margaret confided one evening. "That same quiet strength." Sarah smiled, adding this piece of information to her mental collection. Every personal detail was a tool, every shared confidence a weapon in her arsenal. Behind her caring facade, Sarah was conducting meticulous research. She studied Margaret's investment portfolios, memorized account numbers, and learned the patterns of large transactions that had sustained the Chen family wealth. Her nursing credentials hadn't been her only education. She'd spent years learning the intricacies of financial fraud. The first test came with a small transfer, barely $5,000, disguised as a medical equipment purchase. When questions arose, Sarah waited 3 weeks before attempting another. Each success emboldened her, though she maintained her careful patience. She'd seen others in her position rush, make mistakes, get caught. Sarah was determined to be different. Richard noticed something else during his visits: how Sarah seemed to anticipate market fluctuations with unusual accuracy. "Have you considered a career in finance?" he asked her once, half joking. Sarah demurred, claiming she only picked up bits and pieces from managing her own modest investments. In truth, she'd been studying financial markets for years, preparing for exactly this type of opportunity. As summer approached, Margaret began receiving invitations to charity galas and social events. Sarah expertly managed these too, deciding which ones would be too taxing for her patient's health. Gradually, Margaret's social circle shrank, her connections to the outside world increasingly filtered through Sarah's careful control. Only Mrs. Rivera continued to watch Sarah with suspicious eyes. The housekeeper had worked for the Chens since before Emily was born, and something about the nurse's perfect composure set her on edge. But her concerns, voiced in rapid Spanish during phone calls to her daughter, remained unspoken to Margaret. After all, who would believe a housekeeper over such a competent, caring nurse? In her guest house each evening, Sarah meticulously documented her progress. Her laptop contained encrypted files tracking every detail of Margaret's life, every weakness discovered, every security measure bypassed. The fortune she was slowly siphoning away was only part of her satisfaction. There was also pride in the elegance of her execution, the masterpiece of manipulation she was creating. What Sarah failed to notice, however, was that she wasn't the only one keeping careful records. Behind Margaret's seemingly drowsy exterior, behind the occasional trembling hands and forgetful moments, a lifetime of business acumen remained razor-sharp, and Margaret Chen had learned long ago that sometimes the best defense was to appear defenseless. The first significant transfer, $200,000, disappeared during a particularly hot July afternoon. Sarah had timed it perfectly, waiting until Margaret was distracted by her weekly physical therapy session. The money moved through 3 separate accounts before landing in an offshore holding company Sarah had established months earlier. She celebrated that evening with a quiet glass of champagne in her guest house, allowing herself a small smile at her success. Unknown to Sarah, that same evening, Emily Chen was staring at her phone in her San Francisco apartment, thumb hovering over her mother's number. 5 years had passed since their last real conversation, a bitter argument about Emily choosing art over the family business. Now, automated alerts from the family trust were showing unusual patterns, but pride and hurt kept her from making the call. Instead, she forwarded the notifications to Uncle Richard, as she'd done with all family matters since the falling out. Sarah's lifestyle began to shift subtly. Designer bags replaced her practical nursing totes. Her sensible shoes gave way to Christian Louboutins, though she was careful to wear them only on her days off. She bought a new car. Nothing too flashy, but certainly beyond a nurse's typical means, explaining to Margaret that it was an inheritance from a distant aunt. "My family has good financial sense," Sarah had said, smoothly deflecting Margaret's mild curiosity. "Like yours, Mrs. Chen, we believe in careful investment." The irony of her words brought her private satisfaction. During her weekend shopping trips, Sarah began laying groundwork for her eventual disappearance. She established connections with a private banker who specialized in discreet international transfers. Premium credit cards were acquired under slightly altered versions of her name. A realtor in the Cayman Islands began sending her property listings. Margaret observed all of this through half-closed eyes during her afternoon naps. She noticed the subtle shift in Sarah's perfume from department store to exclusive boutique. She saw the tiny red soles peeking out from under Sarah's pants when she thought no one was looking. Each detail was carefully noted in a journal hidden inside a hollow book in her bedside table, a trick she'd learned during her early business days dealing with unreliable partners. The most telling change came during their morning routine. Sarah, growing increasingly confident, began sharing small details about her planned vacation. Casual mentions of tropical destinations, questions about Margaret's own travel experiences. Each conversation was a test, probing for any sign of suspicion. One morning, as Sarah helped Margaret with her medications, a gold Cartier bracelet slipped from beneath her sleeve. Margaret's sharp eyes caught the inscription, a manufacturing date from just 2 weeks prior. That same afternoon, she made a phone call while Sarah was running errands. "Richard? It's worse than we thought," Margaret whispered into the phone. "Check the offshore accounts. All of them." She hung up before Sarah returned, resuming her pose of elderly docility. In her office downtown, Emily received another alert. This time, the amount made her stomach turn. $500,000 moved through a series of complicated transactions. Her artist's fingers, stained with oils from her latest painting, clenched around the phone. Something about the pattern seemed familiar, reminiscent of the financial schemes her mother had taught her to recognize years ago. For the first time in 5 years, Emily began to seriously consider returning home. She pulled up her mother's contact information again, but instead of calling, she began researching flights to her hometown. If she was going to break the silence, she would do it in person. Some conversations needed to happen face to face. Meanwhile, Sarah added another entry to her private ledger. The total now exceeded $1 million, but she was far from finished. In her mind, she was already planning the next transfer, unaware that her perfect plan had developed its first cracks. She failed to notice how Margaret's hand trembled, slightly less, when she thought no one was watching, or how Mrs. Rivera had started working later into the evenings, her suspicious eyes cataloguing every detail of Sarah's comings and goings. The autumn chill had settled over the city when Margaret received the call from her bank's fraud department. $3 million had vanished from her accounts over the past year. The bank representative's voice was professionally concerned, explaining the complex web of transfers that had only now triggered their highest-level alerts. Margaret listened silently, her free hand gripping her cane until her knuckles turned white. "Yes, I understand," she said calmly, watching Sarah work in the garden through her study window. "Please don't flag the accounts yet. I need to consult with my attorney first." She ended the call just as Sarah looked up, offering her characteristic, warm smile through the glass. That evening, Margaret made 2 calls from her private line when Sarah was out getting groceries. The first was to Margaret Chen, her late husband's cousin and a retired police detective. The second was to Maya Patel, a forensic accountant who had helped the Chen family identify corporate espionage attempts in the past. "I need this handled quietly," Margaret instructed Maya. "No official investigations yet, just follow the money." Her voice carried the same steel that had once commanded boardrooms across Asia and America. Sarah remained blissfully unaware of these movements, her confidence growing with each successful transaction. She had recently begun making bolder moves, transferring larger sums through an intricate network of shell companies. Her offshore account was swelling, and she'd already put a deposit on a beachfront villa in the Caymans. What she didn't realize was that Margaret had photographed every designer purchase, every new piece of jewelry. Mrs. Rivera had been secretly documenting Sarah's schedule, noting every unexplained absence and suspicious phone call. The evidence was building, carefully catalogued in a secure cloud drive that Richard had set up years ago for sensitive business documents. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, the bank manager who had been helping Sarah hide. Her transactions, James Morrison, had his own secrets. Margaret's private investigator discovered his gambling debts and, more importantly, his pattern of helping other criminals launder money through elderly victims' accounts. "He's done this before," Jason reported during a secure video call. "At least 3 other cases in the past 5 years, all wealthy seniors, all with trusted caretakers who suddenly came into money." Margaret's expression remained neutral as she reviewed the files Jason had sent. Photos showed Sarah meeting with Morrison at upscale restaurants, documents changing hands over expensive wines. In one image, Sarah was clearly wearing a watch worth more than her annual salary. The pieces were falling into place, but Margaret knew timing would be crucial. She needed Sarah to feel completely secure, to believe her elderly victim remained. Oblivious, each morning she continued to play her part, the forgetful widow, increasingly dependent on her dedicated nurse. "Sarah, dear," she called out one afternoon, her voice deliberately frail. "I seem to have forgotten how to access my email again. Would you mind helping me?" She watched as Sarah efficiently logged in, noting how her nurse's fingers hesitated briefly over the keyboard, likely contemplating another opportunity for theft. Behind the scenes, Maya was meticulously tracking every dollar, building a comprehensive map of Sarah's financial network. The evidence was mounting, but Margaret wasn't ready to strike. Not yet. She needed Sarah to make one crucial mistake, one overconfident move that would leave her no room for escape. That moment came sooner than expected. Sarah initiated a transfer for $5 million, the largest yet. As Margaret received the alert on her hidden phone, a small smile played across her lips. The trap was almost ready to spring. The first crack in Sarah's perfect mask appeared during breakfast. Margaret had casually mentioned meeting with her financial advisors, and for a split second, panic flashed across Sarah's face. It was gone instantly, replaced by her usual caring smile. But Margaret had seen it, the predator beneath the nurse's uniform. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully modulated. "You know how those meetings tire you out. Perhaps we should reschedule." Her hands moved swiftly, already reaching for the phone. "No need, dear," Margaret replied, hiding her triumph behind a sip of tea. "Richard insists on reviewing some irregularities. In person." She watched as Sarah's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the phone. That afternoon, Sarah made 3 urgent calls from the garden, unaware that every word was being recorded by the sophisticated surveillance system Jason had installed. Her conversation with James Morrison was particularly revealing. "It has to be done now," she hissed into the phone. "Move everything to the secondary accounts immediately." Gone was the gentle nurse's tone, replaced by sharp commands. "I don't care about the fees. Just do it." Margaret had already moved her remaining assets to new, secure accounts, ones that Sarah couldn't access. Richard had helped her execute the transfers under the guise of routine estate planning. They'd left just enough in the original accounts to maintain Sarah's illusion of control. The deeper Sarah dug, the more her composure slipped. She began making mistakes. A drawer left open revealed documents she'd been forging. Her overnight bag, accidentally visible during a medication check, contained a false passport. Each slip was meticulously photographed and added to Maya's growing file. Margaret noticed other changes too. Sarah's gentle touch became rougher during physical therapy. Her patience wore thin when Margaret accidentally asked the same questions repeatedly. The mask of compassion was cracking, revealing glimpses of frustration and contempt. During their evening routine, Sarah's true nature emerged more clearly. "You know, Mrs. Chen," she said, measuring out medications with unusual force. "Sometimes I wonder if you really need all these pills. Your mind seems to wander so much these days." The threat was subtle but clear, a reminder of how completely Margaret seemed to depend on her. What Sarah didn't know was that Margaret had replaced the sleeping pills with harmless substitutes months ago. Every night she pretended to grow drowsy, while remaining perfectly alert, documenting Sarah's nighttime activities. The final piece fell into place when Mrs. Rivera discovered Sarah's burner phone, forgotten in the laundry. The phone contained messages to other nurses across the country, a network of predators sharing tips on targeting wealthy, elderly victims. Margaret's private investigator traced 3 of them to unsolved cases of financial exploitation. "The net is ready," Jason assured Margaret during their secured video call. "We just need her to take one more step." Margaret nodded, her expression grim but determined. Years of business negotiations had taught her the value of patience, of letting an opponent overreach. Sarah, meanwhile, was finalizing her escape. Flights were booked under an alias. Offshore accounts were prepared to receive the final transfers, and her replacement identity was nearly complete. She believed she was moments away from her biggest score yet, unaware that she was walking into a trap years in the making. Detective Lisa Martinez sat across from Margaret in a private room at the Golden Dragon restaurant, her case file spread between plates of untouched dim sum. The detective's dark eyes narrowed as she reviewed the evidence, particularly the connections to other victims. "Mrs. Chen, what you've uncovered here goes beyond simple theft," Martinez said, holding up a photograph of Sarah meeting with another accused nurse in Seattle. "This is organized crime targeting the elderly. We've been tracking similar cases for months, but could never connect the dots." Margaret nodded, sliding another folder across the table. "Patricia Thompson, age 78, lost $2 million in Florida. Robert Garcia, 82, lost his entire retirement in Arizona. Both had private nurses, with credentials similar to Sarah's." Her voice carried the weight of countless hours of private investigation. The restaurant, owned by an old family friend, provided perfect cover for these meetings. Sarah believed Margaret was attending her weekly mahjong game, never suspecting that the quiet back room had become command central for the investigation. As they talked, more victims' families arrived. A widow from Portland, whose husband had been stripped of his savings months before his death. A retired judge whose sister had lost everything to a charming male nurse. Each story followed the same pattern: trusted caregivers who gradually gained control of finances before disappearing with millions. "They're careful," Martinez explained, pinning photos to a concealed evidence board. "They work slowly, building trust over months or years. By the time anyone notices the theft, they've usually vanished completely." She turned to Margaret with newfound respect. "You're the first one to catch them in the act." Margaret's preparedness didn't stop with documentation. She'd installed hidden cameras throughout the house, their feeds monitored by Jason's team. Every room except the bathrooms was under surveillance, capturing Sarah's increasingly suspicious behavior. "Look at this," Jason said, playing a recording from the previous night. The footage showed Sarah in Margaret's study at 3 a.m., methodically photographing financial documents. "She's preparing for something big." Detective Martinez leaned forward, studying Sarah's movements on screen. She's not working alone. These gestures, the way she's organizing the documents, she's been trained. This is too professional for a random fraudster. The investigation had revealed a disturbing pattern in Sarah's background. Her nursing credentials, while technically real, had been obtained through a series of suspicious circumstances. 3 different nursing schools, each with questionable record-keeping practices, employment references that led to disconnected phone numbers. We found similar patterns with other suspects, Martinez explained, spreading out a timeline of related cases. They target wealthy seniors in different states, work clean for about a year, then drain the accounts and disappear. Usually they have an inside person at a bank. Margaret's expression remained calm as she shared her own discoveries. James Morrison isn't just helping Sarah. He's their gateway into the banking system. Every victim had accounts at banks where he worked or had connections. The evidence was mounting, but they needed more. Martinez's team had placed surveillance on Morrison, tracking his meetings with other suspects. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her performance as the perfect victim, even as she helped build an unbreakable case. "Tomorrow," Margaret announced, sliding a final document across the table, "Sarah will attempt to transfer the remaining funds. Everything is prepared." She smiled, a glimpse of the shrewd businesswoman she'd once been shining through. "She believes I've signed power of attorney over to her. What she doesn't know is that every signature is documented as being signed under duress." Detective Martinez gathered the files, impressed by the thoroughness of Margaret's preparation. "We'll be ready. But Mrs. Chen," she paused, her expression serious, "be careful. When people like Sarah realize they've been caught, they can become dangerous." Margaret's eyes hardened with determination. "My dear detective, I've dealt with dangerous people my entire career. Sarah thinks she's hunting a helpless old woman. She's about to learn how wrong she is." The Chen family's old warehouse district office had been converted into luxury apartments years ago, but the basement conference room remained untouched. Here, surrounded by decades of business history, Margaret held court with allies from her past. Former partners, retired executives, and trusted employees, people who owed their success to the Chen family's guidance, gathered to help bring down Sarah's network. "Victor," Margaret addressed her former head of security, now running his own international consulting firm, "what did your team find in Sarah's past?" She watched as the silver-haired man connected his laptop to the ancient projector they'd used for countless presentations. "Her real name isn't Sarah Williams," Victor revealed, displaying a series of driver's licenses with Sarah's photo, but different names. "We've traced at least 5 identities across 3 countries. The earliest record we found was in Vancouver. Caroline Peters graduated from nursing school in 2015. That identity disappeared after her first victim lost $1.2 million. Margaret's network had advantages law enforcement couldn't match. Private investigators who didn't need warrants, foreign contacts who could trace international money transfers, and tech experts who could decrypt Sarah's communications. Each person in the room had a stake in protecting their mentor and friend. Thomas Wong, Margaret's former accountant, now managing partner at a prestigious firm, spread out financial records across the table. The money moves through a sophisticated network, casino accounts, shell companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, but there's always a pattern. His fingers traced the flow of funds across multiple diagrams. She gets sloppy when she thinks she's won. That's how we caught her trail in the Thompson case. The investigation had revealed darker aspects of Sarah's operations. A retired nurse in Seattle had died mysteriously after questioning similar transfers. A witness in Florida had suffered a convenient accident before he could testify. Each incident had been carefully crafted to appear natural, but the pattern was clear to those who knew where to look. "She's escalating," Detective Martinez noted, joining them via secure video link. The amounts are getting larger, the timeline shorter. She's planning something bigger than her usual scam. Margaret's old friend Helen Zhang, now a retired judge, provided another crucial piece of information. I've been reviewing similar cases across the country. There's a pattern in how they choose their victims: wealthy, isolated, with complex financial portfolios that make theft harder to detect. But you, Margaret, you're different. You're their biggest target yet. The scope of Sarah's organization became clearer with each revelation. Bank employees were paid to override security measures. Real estate agents helped launder money through property deals. Even some medical professionals were involved, providing documentation to support their schemes. What troubles me, Victor interjected, pulling up another file, is her connection to this man. The screen showed security footage of Sarah meeting with a well-dressed older man at an upscale hotel. James Morrison's boss, Charles Weber. He's been investigated for fraud multiple times but never charged. We think he's the one training these nurses. Margaret absorbed each detail, her mind working through strategies like she had in her business days. The network she'd built over decades was now forming a noose around Sarah's organization. But she knew they had to be careful. One wrong move could send their quarry running. "We have something they don't expect," Margaret finally said, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded boardrooms. "They think they're targeting isolated victims. Instead, they've walked into a web of connections they never imagined existed." The meeting concluded with assignments distributed. Victor's team would continue surveillance. Thomas would track the money. Helen would coordinate with law enforcement in other jurisdictions. Each person left with a clear purpose, driven by loyalty to the woman who had mentored them all. As Margaret was helped into her car, she allowed herself a small smile. Sarah thought she was manipulating a lonely old woman. She had no idea she was facing the combined resources of a business empire built on outsmarting much more dangerous opponents. Emily Chen stood in her mother's study, staring at the evidence wall they'd created behind a false panel. 5 years of separation melted away as she applied her artist's eye to the pattern of Sarah's crimes. Red strings connected photos, bank statements, and victim profiles, telling a story of calculated predation. "She always starts the same way," Emily noted, touching a photograph of Sarah in her nursing uniform. "Gain their trust through perfect service, isolate them from family, then begin with small financial favors." Her finger traced the string to another photo, an elderly man in Florida, now deceased. "Just like she did with you, Mom." Margaret watched her daughter work, remembering how Emily's analytical mind had always matched her own. "Keep going," she encouraged softly. "What else do you see?" Emily moved methodically across the wall. 3 deaths in 5 years, all ruled natural causes. But look at the timing. Each death occurred within weeks of large transfers. She pulled out her tablet, bringing up the forensic accountant's report. The victims' families never suspected anything because she built such a convincing facade of care. Detective Martinez's latest report had revealed Sarah's earliest known identity, Jennifer Brooks, a nursing student who had disappeared after her wealthy grandfather's suspicious death. The inheritance had funded her transformation into Caroline Peters, launching her career as a predator of the elderly. "She's careful about appearances," Emily continued, pointing to surveillance photos. "Designer clothes, but nothing flashy. Expensive jewelry, but worn only in private. She maintains the image of a dedicated nurse living modestly on her salary." Her hand clenched, "while she steals millions from people who trusted her." Margaret moved to stand beside her daughter, their reflection in the window showing 2 generations of Chen women united in purpose. "What troubles me is the organization behind her. This isn't just one corrupt nurse, it's a systematic operation." Emily nodded, pulling up more files on her tablet. Her tech skills, honed from years of digital art, had proven invaluable in tracing Sarah's online activities. Look at these training manuals we found on her cloud drive. Detailed instructions on everything. How to forge signatures, which medications cause memory issues, even scripts for gaining trust. The manuals had been encrypted, but Emily's knowledge of digital security had helped crack them. Inside was a predator's playbook, revealing how the organization groomed and trained its operators. Sarah wasn't just a star pupil. She had become a mentor to newer recruits. "There's something else," Emily said, hesitating. "I found communications with other nurses currently embedded with wealthy families, at least 12 potential victims, all being systematically stripped of their assets." She turned to her mother. "They're accelerating their timeline. Something big is coming." Margaret's expression hardened. "They're preparing to move on all their targets simultaneously, a coordinated attack that would let them disappear with millions. Before anyone realizes what's happened." She touched a document on the wall. "Sarah's planning to trigger it here, with us." Emily's artistic hands, stained with paint from her latest project, traced the pattern of transactions. "She thinks she's got you isolated and helpless, the perfect victim." A smile so like her mother's crossed her face. "She has no idea what she's walking into." The investigation had revealed Sarah's success rate, perfect until now. Each victim had been carefully chosen, systematically exploited, and left with nothing. Some had died before realizing what had happened. Others were too ashamed to fight back, but Sarah had never encountered anyone like Margaret Chen. "Mom," Emily said softly, "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. When I saw the financial alerts, I thought—" She trailed off, remembering their arguments about money and duty. Margaret took her daughter's hand. "You came when it mattered most. Your skills, your perspective. They're exactly what we need." She smiled. "Though I never expected to bond with my daughter over catching a criminal." As they updated the evidence wall, both women knew they were racing against time. Sarah's network was preparing for their biggest operation yet, and Margaret's fortune was meant to be the crown jewel of their theft. But with each piece of evidence Emily uncovered, with each connection Margaret's allies revealed, the trap grew stronger. In the garden, Sarah watched the lights in the study, unaware that her perfect victim was becoming her worst nightmare. Inside, mother and daughter worked late into the night, their years of separation forgotten in their shared mission to bring down a predator who had underestimated them both. The winter rain drummed against the study windows as Margaret reviewed the latest bank statements with Thomas. They had created an elaborate network of accounts, each one a carefully baited trap. $5 million. Real money, but carefully traced, sat waiting in the primary account like a gleaming lure. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked, noting how Margaret's hands trembled as she signed the transfer authorizations. This time, the tremor wasn't an act. The stress of maintaining her facade was taking a genuine toll on her health. "We need her to think she's winning," Margaret replied, pressing her thumbprint to the biometric scanner. "Sarah's watching every account. The moment she sees this money move, she'll think I'm liquidating assets for her next big theft." The plan was intricate. Each account was monitored by both bank security and private investigators. Every dollar was tagged with digital markers that would trace its movement. But the real genius lay in the apparent vulnerability of it all. Margaret had made the security just weak enough to tempt Sarah into action. Later that afternoon, Margaret's actual health concerns surfaced during a visit from her private physician. Dr. Chen, no relation. Her blood pressure had spiked, and the doctor insisted on adjusting her medication. Sarah hovered nearby, playing the concerned nurse perfectly, even as her eyes gleamed at signs of her victim's declining health. "Perhaps we should consider full-time care," Sarah suggested smoothly, her practiced concern masking her eagerness. "A nursing home might be safer." Her hand rested possessively on Margaret's medical file. "No," Margaret wheezed, allowing real fatigue to color her voice. "I want to stay in my home." She clutched Sarah's hand, noting how her nurse's fingers twitched at the contact. "Promise me you'll help me stay here." Emily, watching through the hidden cameras, saw Sarah's mask slip for just a moment. A flash of triumph crossed her face, before the caring facade returned. "Of course, Mrs. Chen, I'll take care of everything." That evening, Margaret's team tracked Sarah's encrypted communications with her associates. The nurse had taken the bait, reporting Margaret's apparent decline and the newly accessible funds. The organization's response was immediate: accelerate the timeline. "She's planning to move within the week," Jason reported during their secure video call. "Morrison's already preparing the offshore transfers. They think your health issues have given them the perfect opportunity." Margaret allowed herself a grim smile, even as her chest tightened with genuine discomfort. The physical strain of maintaining this deception was considerable, but she had endured worse during her business battles. She took her actual medication after pretending to swallow Sarah's doctored pills, careful to maintain the delicate balance between real and feigned vulnerability. Detective Martinez's team had positioned surveillance units around the property. They tracked Sarah's midnight meetings with Morrison, photographed her preparations for escape, and documented every communication with her criminal network. The evidence was overwhelming, but they needed to catch her in the act of theft. "Mom," Emily whispered during a private moment, seeing the toll this was taking. "We can end this now. We have enough to arrest her." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. We need to expose the entire organization. Too many vulnerable people are at risk." She squeezed her daughter's hand. "I've spent my life protecting our family's interests. Let me protect others too." The next morning, Sarah found Margaret, appearing particularly frail, dozing in her favorite chair. The nurse quickly accessed the main computer, checking the accounts they'd set up. Her excitement was barely contained when she saw the newly accessible millions. "Rest well, Mrs. Chen," Sarah murmured, her gentle tone at odds with her predatory smile. "Everything will be over soon." She didn't notice the tiny camera in Margaret's brooch, recording every move, every expression. In the security room they'd established nearby, Emily watched the footage with Detective Martinez. "She's ready to strike," the detective observed. "Your mother's performance is convincing." "Too convincing," Emily replied, worried. The strain was visible in Margaret's features even through the camera, but she recognized the determination in her mother's bearing. The same strength that had built an empire was now focused on destroying a predator who targeted the vulnerable. Unknown to Sarah, every account she monitored was a carefully constructed illusion. The real funds were secure, the accessible millions a sophisticated trap. As she moved through the house that night, making final preparations, Margaret lay awake, her heart racing with both anxiety and anticipation. The endgame was approaching, and despite her physical challenges, her mind remained sharp as ever. Sarah was about to learn why Margaret Chen had never lost a battle she chose to fight. The first warning came from James Morrison during their clandestine meeting at the marina. The bank manager's usual smooth confidence had been replaced by nervous energy as he paced along the dock, his expensive shoes clicking against the wooden planks. "Something's not right," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "These transfers, they're too clean. No one with that much money makes things this easy." He thrust a folder at Sarah, his hands shaking. "And why is Chen liquidating assets now, after years of complex holdings?" Sarah skimmed the documents, her practiced calm slipping. The $5 million sat waiting, almost begging to be taken. "You're being paranoid," she snapped. But a seed of doubt had been planted. "Mrs. Chen is declining rapidly. She barely remembers her own name some days." "Then explain this." Morrison pulled up a transaction on his phone. "Last week, one of her old business accounts activated, an account I didn't even know existed. When I tried to access it, I got flagged by internal security." Sarah's mind raced. She'd been so careful, monitoring every account, every transaction. But what if she'd missed something? What if the doddering old woman wasn't as helpless as she appeared? Back at the Chen estate, Sarah began noticing small details she'd overlooked. The way Margaret's hand tremor disappeared when she thought no one was watching. How Mrs. Rivera seemed to time her cleaning schedule to Sarah's movements. The sudden appearance of new security cameras around the property explained away as routine upgrades. That evening, Sarah made an urgent call to Charles Weber, her organization's leader. "I think we need to accelerate the timeline," she whispered. From the garden, aware of the cameras but confident she was out of range. "Something feels off." Weber's voice carried a note of warning. "Don't get skittish now. This is our biggest score yet. If you spook and run, I'll make sure you never work again." The threat was clear. Besides, we have teams in place with 12 other targets. Everything moves together, or not at all. Sarah ended the call, her composure cracking. In the kitchen window, she caught a glimpse of Margaret watching her, and for a moment their eyes met. The old woman's gaze held none of the confusion Sarah had come to expect. Instead, there was something else, a sharpness that sent a chill down her spine. Desperate for reassurance, Sarah logged into the offshore accounts where she'd been transferring funds. The numbers looked right, but something about the routing code seemed different. She double-checked her records, finding small discrepancies she'd missed before. Morrison called again near midnight, his voice tight with panic. "Weber's asking questions about the Chen accounts. He thinks we're being played." A pause. "If he's right, we're both dead." Sarah paced her guest house, her perfect plan unraveling. She'd chosen Margaret Chen because she seemed like the ideal victim, wealthy, isolated, declining in health, but now every certainty was being questioned. She decided to test her suspicions. During Margaret's morning medication routine, Sarah deliberately mixed up the pills. Any truly declining patient would never notice, but as she turned away, she caught Margaret's reflection in the window, calmly pocketing the incorrect medication. The game was shifting. Sarah had always been the predator, carefully stalking her prey. Now, for the first time, she felt like she was being hunted. Late that night, Sarah broke into Margaret's study, searching for any evidence of her suspicions. As she rifled through the desk drawers, a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around to find Mrs. Rivera standing in the doorway, a knowing smile on her face. "Looking for something, señorita?" the housekeeper asked, her accent suddenly less pronounced. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Rivera disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to contact Weber again. The call went straight to voicemail. Morrison wasn't answering either. The walls were closing in, but she was in too deep to run. Millions of dollars were within reach, and her organization would never forgive her for backing out now. In her bedroom upstairs, Margaret Chen sat at her vanity, methodically removing her makeup, the carefully applied products that had made her appear more frail, more confused. Tonight, she allowed herself to look strong, alert, dangerous. The prey was finally realizing it was trapped, and the real hunt was about to begin. Sarah's world was collapsing. Morrison had gone dark after their marina meeting, and her calls to Weber were being met with increasingly hostile responses. She paced her guest house at 3 a.m., surrounded by spread-out documents and bank statements, searching desperately for a way to salvage her plan. Her burner phone buzzed, a message from another nurse in their network. "Weber says move now. All teams go at midnight tomorrow." Sarah's hands trembled as she deleted the message. 12 wealthy victims across the country, all targeted for simultaneous theft. It was supposed to be their masterpiece, but everything felt wrong. In the main house, Margaret hosted what appeared to be an innocent family dinner. Emily had surprised them with a visit, and Sarah watched with growing unease as mother and daughter shared knowing looks across the table. Their previous estrangement seemed to have vanished overnight. "Sarah, dear," Margaret called out, her voice carrying that familiar fragile quaver that now seemed somehow false. "Would you help me with the banking tomorrow? I'd like to make some significant transfers for Emily's art gallery." The invitation was too perfect, too convenient. Sarah forced a smile. Of course, Mrs. Chen, though perhaps we should consult with the financial advisor first. She was stalling, trying to buy time to figure out what was wrong. No need, Margaret replied, her eyes sharp despite her frail appearance. I trust you completely with my finances. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Later that night, Sarah received an urgent email from Morrison, routed through their secure server. They're on to us. Weber's cleaning house. Get out now. Attached were wire transfer codes for their emergency escape plan, codes that looked subtly different from their usual protocols. Panic drove Sarah to take her biggest risk yet. She crept into Margaret's study after midnight, using her copied keys to access the primary computer. The $5 million sat there, tempting her to grab everything and run, but she hesitated, Morrison's warnings echoing in her mind. A soft cough from the doorway made her jump. Emily stood there, casually, holding a cup of tea. Can't sleep? She asked, her tone pleasant but her eyes cold. Mom sometimes has trouble sleeping too. She says it's because her mind is too active, always planning something. Sarah stammered an excuse about checking on Margaret's medication schedule, but Emily's knowing smile stopped her mid-sentence. As she retreated to her guest house, she heard mother and daughter talking quietly in the study, their voices too low to make out the words. The next morning brought another shock. Morrison's body had been found in his car outside the bank, an apparent heart attack. Sarah knew better. Weber was tying up loose ends. Her own time was running out. In desperation, she called one of her previous victims' families, using an alias to probe for any signs of investigation. The call confirmed her worst fears. Detective Martinez had been asking questions, connecting cases across state lines. Margaret spent the day making a show of increasing confusion, but Sarah caught her exchanging text messages with someone when she thought no one was watching. Each time Sarah entered a room, hushed conversations would stop, documents would vanish into drawers. Mrs. Rivera had dropped all pretense of being just a housekeeper. She moved through the house with military precision, her eyes constantly tracking Sarah's movements. Even the gardener seemed to be reporting on her activities, speaking rapidly into a phone whenever she passed. By evening, Sarah knew she had to act. Weber's midnight deadline loomed, and she could feel the trap closing in. She began gathering her essential documents, preparing for either the biggest score of her career or an emergency escape. In her office, Margaret Chen removed her oversized cardigan, revealing the strong posture she'd been hiding for months. She checked her surveillance feeds one last time, confirming that every camera was in place, every recording device active. Years of business acumen had taught her to leave nothing to chance. "Everything ready?" Emily asked, entering with a stack of final documents. Margaret nodded, her expression fierce. "Sarah thinks she's making the choice to act tonight. She doesn't. Realize every option leads exactly where we want her to go." She pulled up the fake bank accounts on her screen, the bait that would spring their trap. "Let's show her what happens when you underestimate Margaret Chen." At precisely 11:30 p.m., Sarah initiated the first transfer. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, entering the familiar account numbers and routing codes. Everything looked normal until she hit confirm. Instead of the usual processing message, a different screen appeared, one showing every fraudulent transaction she'd made over the past 3 years. Her phone buzzed. A text from Weber. "You've been compromised. Morrison talked before he died." Sarah's blood ran cold as another message followed. "You're on your own. Assets frozen." One by one, her access to their shared accounts vanished. The sound of footsteps made her spin around. Margaret stood in the doorway of the study, her posture straight, all signs of frailty gone. "Looking for something?" The old woman's voice was strong, carrying the authority of someone used to commanding boardrooms. "Perhaps your offshore accounts? I'm afraid those were transferred back to their rightful owners hours ago." Sarah lunged for her laptop, desperately trying to access her private accounts. Each attempt was met with the same message: account frozen pending federal investigation. The trap had been perfectly designed, every escape route cut off, every contingency planned for. "You really should have researched me more thoroughly," Margaret continued, moving into the room with confident steps. "Before I retired, I specialized in corporate takeovers, identifying weak points, setting traps, waiting for my opponents to overextend themselves." She smiled, the expression both triumphant and dangerous. "You're not the first predator I've caught, Sarah, or should I say Caroline or Jennifer." Sarah's mind raced through options. The emergency cash in her guest house, the fake passport, the backup phone. But as she mentally catalogued each escape plan, she realized with growing horror that they had all been compromised. Her burner phone lit up with messages from other nurses in their network. Similar scenes were playing out across the country. Their elderly victims had been working together, coordinating with law enforcement. The entire operation was being dismantled simultaneously. "Morrison didn't just talk," Margaret explained, seating herself regally behind the desk. "He gave us everything, every account, every conspirator, every victim. Your friend Weber's been under surveillance for weeks. Right now he's being arrested in the Caymans, where he thought he was safe." Through the window, Sarah spotted movement in the garden. Police officers were taking up positions around the house. She recognized Detective Martinez coordinating the teams, her earlier friendly demeanor replaced by professional focus. "Did you really think I was helpless?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying decades of steel beneath its surface. "That I wouldn't notice the discrepancies in my accounts? That my confusion wasn't an act to draw you out?" She pressed a button on her desk phone. "Emily, dear, would you join us?" Sarah backed toward the door, but Mrs. Rivera appeared behind her, blocking her escape. The housekeeper's gentle demeanor had vanished, replaced by the bearing of the former federal agent she truly was. "You know what your biggest mistake was?" Margaret continued, watching Sarah's desperate glances around the room. "You assumed age meant weakness, that someone who needed physical help must also be mentally helpless." She nodded to Emily, who entered carrying a thick file. "Instead, you gave me time to investigate, to plan, to set my own trap." The sound of police radios crackled outside as the net drew tighter. Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. A message from Weber's arrest. They knew everything. The old woman played us all. Margaret Chen rose from her desk, every inch the business titan she'd once been. "I spent my life protecting people from predators like you," she declared. "Did you really think I'd let you steal from me, then walk away to harm others? No, Sarah. Tonight your hunt ends." Sarah's training had prepared her for many scenarios, but not for this moment, trapped in a study with her victim transforming into her prosecutor. Her eyes darted to the decorative letter opener on Margaret's desk, calculating odds, measuring distances. Margaret noticed the glance. "Don't," she warned, pressing a button that turned the study's windows transparent, revealing police snipers positioned outside. "Every move you make is being recorded. Detective Martinez has a full tactical team in place." As if on cue, Emily began playing video recordings on the study's large monitor. Sarah watched herself stealing documents late at night, making suspicious calls from the garden, meeting with Morrison at the marina. The footage was crystal clear, damning. "We have it all," Emily explained, her artistic hands gesturing at the screens. "Every conversation with Weber, every fraudulent transfer, every meeting with other members of your organization." She turned to another monitor. "And here's my personal favorite, you discussing previous victims with your associates." Sarah's composure finally cracked. "Those recordings are inadmissible," she snarled. "You needed warrants." "Oh, but we had them," Margaret interrupted, sliding a stack of legal documents across the desk. "Every surveillance device, every monitored call, every tracked transaction, all authorized by federal judges. Did you think I spent 50 years in business without learning how to do things legally?" Through the windows, Sarah watched more police vehicles arrive. Detective Martinez's voice crackled over a megaphone. "Sarah Williams, the building is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." They're arresting your colleagues across the country right now, Emily added, pulling up live news feeds on her tablet. Weber's private servers have been seized. The evidence goes back decades. Every victim, every theft, every suspicious death. Sarah lunged for her phone, but Mrs. Rivera moved faster, pinning her arm with professional efficiency. The housekeeper's grip revealed years of law enforcement training. 15 victims in 5 years, Margaret recited, opening a thick folder. 8 dead under suspicious circumstances. Millions stolen from elderly victims who trusted you. Her voice carried the weight of every person Sarah had betrayed. But you didn't just steal their money. You stole their dignity, their security, their faith in humanity. Police officers were moving through the house now, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. Sarah tried one last desperate gambit. "I can give you others," she offered frantically. "Names, accounts, operations you don't know about. We already have everything." Emily cut her off, displaying more surveillance photos. Mum's business contacts traced every account, every shell company, every hidden asset. The forensic accountants have reconstructed all of it. Margaret stood, her presence filling the room. "I spent 3 years playing the helpless victim, watching you prey on others, gathering evidence, not just to catch you, but to dismantle your entire operation." She smiled grimly. "Consider it my last corporate takeover." The study door opened, and Detective Martinez entered with 2 officers. "Sarah Williams," she began, "you're under arrest. For fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy." Sarah barely heard the list of charges as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Through the window, she saw news vans arriving, their lights illuminating the night. Her perfectly constructed world had collapsed in less than an hour. As she was led away, Sarah looked back one last time. Margaret Chen stood framed in the study doorway, straight-backed and powerful, all pretense of weakness gone. Behind her, Emily and Mrs. Rivera flanked her like guards, while video evidence of Sarah's crimes continued playing on the screens. "Never underestimate an old woman with a lifetime of experience," Margaret called after her. "Some of us spent decades outsmarting people far more dangerous than you." Sarah's training had included escape scenarios, and even in handcuffs, she wasn't finished. As Detective Martinez led her down the mansion's main staircase, she executed her last resort plan. A sudden twist, a practiced shoulder roll, and she broke free, sprinting toward the kitchen's back exit. What she didn't expect was Mrs. Rivera's lightning-fast reaction. The housekeeper smoothly intercepted her, using Sarah's own momentum to pin her against the wall. 20 years FBI, Mrs. Rivera whispered in perfect English. "Did you really think I was just here to clean?" Through the kitchen windows, Sarah watched in horror as her backup plan dissolved. The private helicopter she'd arranged for emergency extraction was landing, but instead of her escape pilot, federal agents emerged, weapons drawn. "Your pilot works for us," Margaret explained, walking calmly down the stairs. "Has for weeks, just like your backup driver, your emergency contacts, and every other escape route you planned." She reached the bottom step, her cane nowhere in sight. "We didn't just dismantle your current operation. We dismantled your entire world." Detective Martinez resumed custody of Sarah, reinforcing the handcuffs. "Let's talk about Patricia Thompson," she said, steering Sarah toward the study. "Specifically, the changes made to her medication shortly before her death." The study had transformed into a command center. Multiple screens displayed live feeds from police operations across the country. Sarah watched as her colleagues were arrested one by one. In Miami, Weber was being led from his yacht in handcuffs. In Seattle, her mentor from nursing school, another key player in their organization, was being taken into custody. Emily worked multiple keyboards, coordinating with forensic teams as they seized servers and documents. "We've recovered over 40 million in stolen assets so far," she reported. "The accounts are being frozen and traced back to their original owners." Margaret settled behind her desk, every inch the corporate strategist. "You know what gave you away?" she asked, opening a file. The way you handled the Singapore transfers. I used that same bank for decades. Did you really think they wouldn't contact me about unusual patterns? Sarah's mind raced through her remaining options, but each potential escape route led to another. Trap! The foreign accounts she'd thought were secure were being systematically locked down. Even her hidden Bitcoin wallets were being emptied. Emily had found and cracked them weeks ago. Your friends at the bank? Margaret continued. They've been helping us track international transfers since March. Those secret accounts in the Caymans, registered to shell companies I created. She smiled. I learned about shell companies while you were still in grade school. The evidence wall now stretched across 3 rooms, documenting years of elaborate theft. Photos showed Sarah with previous victims. Surveillance footage captured damning conversations, and financial records traced every stolen dollar. We found your trophy collection, Detective Martinez added, displaying photos from a raid on Sarah's secret storage unit. Pieces of jewelry from each victim, documents detailing their final days, very thorough, very incriminating. Outside, more news vans arrived. Sarah realized with growing dread that this wasn't just an arrest. It was a public takedown. Her sophisticated operation, years in the making, was being exposed on national television. Mrs. Chen, Sarah tried one last time, think about what I could offer. Information about other operations, bigger targets, like the operation in Vancouver, Margaret interrupted. Or the one starting in Auckland. She handed Martinez another file. We already have all of that. Your encrypted servers weren't as secure as you thought. Emily pulled up more surveillance footage, Sarah's meetings with other nurses, training sessions for new recruits, conversations about selecting victims. The algorithms I designed tracked every communication, she explained. Every email, every call, every text message. We've identified 63 potential victims who haven't been targeted yet. Mrs. Rivera, now openly wearing her FBI credentials, began listing charges, multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse, 3 potential murder charges, international money laundering. She paused. The prosecutors are very interested in your connection to several suspicious deaths. Through the study windows, Sarah watched as agents carried boxes of evidence from her guest house. Her prized possessions, the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the carefully curated symbols of success were being catalogued as evidence of criminal proceeds. You know what your real mistake was? Margaret asked, standing to face her directly. You saw me as a stereotype. A wealthy old woman, too proud to admit her decline, desperate for care and companionship. Her eyes hardened. You never wondered how I built this fortune in the first place. How many adversaries I outlasted, how many takeover attempts I survived. Detective Martinez received a message on her phone. Weber's talking, she announced, offering everything in exchange for consideration, names, dates, accounts, the whole operation. Sarah slumped in defeat as the full scope of her failure became clear. Her perfect scheme, her careful preparations, her backup plans, all had been turned against her by a woman she'd gravely underestimated. Margaret Chen addressed her one final time, voice carrying decades of hard-earned authority. You came into my home planning to destroy me. Instead, you gave me one last victory, one final chance to protect others from predators like you. She turned to Martinez. Detective, I believe we're finished here. As Sarah was led away, the lights of police cars and news cameras illuminated the grand old house on Maple Grove. Inside, Margaret Chen stood at her window, watching her last battle come to an end. Behind her, Emily and Mrs. Rivera continued coordinating with law enforcement, dismantling an empire of elder abuse piece by piece. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters 2 months later as Margaret Chen arrived for Sarah's sentencing hearing. She moved with dignified purpose, Emily at her side, no longer maintaining any pretense of frailty. Behind them came a procession of other victims' families, united in their pursuit of justice. Inside the courtroom, Sarah sat in her prison jumpsuit, her designer clothes and confident demeanor long gone. The evidence against her had proven overwhelming. Weber's testimony had sealed her fate, along with the mountain of documentation Margaret's team had gathered. "In 30 years on the bench," Judge Harrison began, "I've rarely seen a more comprehensive case of organized elder abuse." He shuffled through the case files. 13 counts of grand theft, 8 counts of elder abuse, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence presented by Mrs. Chen and Detective Martinez leaves no room for doubt. Sarah stared straight ahead as the judge continued listing her crimes. The sophisticated operation she'd helped build had crumbled completely. Weber faced 20 years in federal prison. Morrison's involvement had been posthumously proven, his estate seized to repay victims. Across the country, her fellow nurses were accepting plea deals, turning on each other in desperation. The defendant preyed upon society's most vulnerable members, the prosecutor declared during her closing statement. She didn't just steal their money, she stole their dignity, their security, their trust in others, and in at least 3 cases, we believe she stole their lives. Margaret had been the star witness during the trial. Her testimony, delivered with sharp clarity and backed by meticulous evidence, had captivated the jury. She detailed every aspect of Sarah's scheme, explaining how her own business experience had helped her recognize and document the fraud. "When I realized what was happening," Margaret had testified, "I knew I had a choice. I could simply stop her, or I could help expose an entire criminal enterprise. I chose to fight not just for myself, but for every vulnerable person they targeted." The evidence room had been filled with Sarah's trophies, jewelry, documents, and mementos taken from previous victims. Each item told a story of trust betrayed, of lives destroyed by calculated predation. Margaret had helped identify every piece, working with families to ensure their return. Now, as the judge prepared to announce the sentence, Emily squeezed her mother's hand. The past months had healed their relationship, united by purpose and newfound understanding. Together, they'd established a foundation to help other elderly victims of financial abuse, using Margaret's business acumen and Emily's technical skills to protect the vulnerable. "Sarah Williams," Judge Harrison declared, "this court sentences you to 30 years in federal prison. Additionally, you are ordered to make full restitution to your victims, totaling $47 million. He peered over his glasses at the defendant. "You will never again be in a position to harm those entrusted to your care." The courtroom erupted in subdued conversation. Victims' families embraced, years of uncertainty finally ending in justice. Detective Martinez, sitting behind Margaret, nodded in satisfaction. The case had already led to enhanced screening procedures for home healthcare workers and new protocols for monitoring elderly clients' finances. Mrs. Rivera now openly acknowledged. As FBI agent Carmen Torres approached Margaret after the sentencing, "We've identified 3 more networks operating similar schemes," she reported. "Thanks to your case, we have a template for stopping them." The impact of Margaret's stand rippled through the healthcare and financial industries. Banks implemented new security measures specifically designed to detect patterns of elder abuse. Nursing agencies strengthened their background checks. Margaret's story became a case study in protecting vulnerable adults. "Mom," Emily said as they left the courthouse, "do you remember what you taught me about business? About how sometimes the biggest victories come from the worst challenges?" Margaret smiled, thinking of how this final battle had brought her daughter home, had given her one last chance to protect others. "Some predators think age equals weakness," she replied. "They forget that age also brings wisdom, experience, and very long memories." The media swarmed as they descended the courthouse steps. Margaret had become a symbol of resistance against elder abuse, her story inspiring others to speak up, to fight back. She handled the attention with practiced grace, using every interview to raise awareness about financial exploitation of the elderly. In the crowd, she recognized faces of other victims' families, the Thompsons from Florida, finally understanding how their mother had died. The Garcias from Arizona, their father's stolen retirement recovered. Each face represented a life impacted by Sarah's crimes, and each now carried a measure of peace. Detective Martinez joined them outside, her case files finally closed. "We've recovered almost all the stolen funds," she reported. "The international accounts are being unfrozen. Assets are being returned to families." She smiled. "Your corporate takeover experience certainly came in handy." Sarah watched from a barred transport van as Margaret handled the press conference. The elderly woman she'd dismissed as an easy target stood tall at the podium, her voice carrying clearly across. "The courthouse plaza. Today's sentence sends a message," Margaret declared. "Age is not a weakness. Experience is not a liability. And those who prey upon the elderly will face justice." As the van pulled away, Sarah caught a final glimpse of Margaret Chen. Not a victim, but a warrior who had orchestrated her downfall. The woman she'd underestimated had destroyed not just her operation, but an entire criminal enterprise. In trying to prey upon Margaret's perceived weakness, Sarah had instead revealed her own. 1 year after Sarah's sentencing, Margaret sat in her garden, watching Emily install a new security system. The roses were blooming, their fragrance mixing with the spring air. The property had changed, sophisticated cameras now complemented. The ancient trees and a state-of-the-art monitoring system protected the house where Sarah had once roamed freely. "The Foundation approved 5 new cases this morning," Emily called down from her ladder. She had traded her artist's smock for business casual, now splitting her time between painting and running the Chen Elder Protection Foundation. 2 in Miami, 3 in Seattle, all similar patterns to Sarah's operation. The foundation had become Margaret's new purpose. She'd transformed her experience into a weapon against elder abuse, using her business connections and recovered fortune to help other victims. The organization provided legal support, financial investigation, and advocacy for elderly victims of fraud. "Detective Martinez called," Margaret replied, checking her phone. "Weber's testimony helped break open another ring in Chicago. 7 nurses arrested, 4 bank employees indicted." She smiled grimly. "They're using our case as a template for prosecution." The ripples from Sarah's arrest had turned into waves. Banks across the country had implemented the Chen Protocol, a set of security measures specifically designed to detect patterns of elder exploitation. Nursing agencies had overhauled their screening processes, and state legislators were crafting stronger protections for vulnerable adults. Inside the mansion, Mrs. Rivera, now officially Agent Torres, had maintained her cover position, transforming the house into a training facility for law enforcement. Officers learned to recognize signs of financial abuse, studied the sophisticated methods used by predators like Sarah, and practiced intervention techniques. "Your mother's case changed everything," Torres explained to a group of detectives during a training session. "It proved that these aren't isolated incidents. There are organized networks targeting the elderly using professional credentials as cover." The Chen case had become required reading in criminal justice programs. Sarah's methods, Margaret's counterattack, and the intricate financial investigation were studied by law enforcement agencies worldwide. The documentation was so thorough that it had spawned 3 textbooks and countless academic papers. In prison, Sarah's empire continued to unravel. Her former associates turned on each other, desperate for reduced sentences. Each revelation exposed new victims, new schemes, new networks to be dismantled. The 47 million in restitution she'd been ordered to pay had grown to over 60 million as more cases came to light. Margaret's personal healing had paralleled her public victory. The strain of maintaining her vulnerable facade had taken a real toll, requiring months of physical therapy to reverse. But as her body recovered, her relationship with Emily flourished in unexpected ways. "I never understood before," Emily admitted one evening as they reviewed foundation cases. "All those years you spent teaching me about business, about watching for predators, you were trying to protect me from people like Sarah." The Chen family's import-export business had evolved too. Under Emily's guidance, they'd added a cybersecurity division specializing in financial protection for elderly clients. Margaret's experience had revealed a critical gap in the market, one they were uniquely qualified to fill. Regular meetings of Sarah's victims' families continued at the mansion. What had started as a support group had evolved into an advocacy network. Margaret hosted them in the same study where she'd trapped Sarah, now transformed into a command center for fighting elder abuse. "Each case we uncover follows the pattern," Margaret explained during one session. "They look for wealth, isolation, and some degree of physical vulnerability, but they forget that age brings wisdom, and wisdom can be a weapon." The media remained interested in Margaret's story. Documentaries explored the case, journalists sought interviews, and Hollywood producers pitched movie rights. Margaret channeled the attention toward advocacy, using every platform to educate the public about elder exploitation. Detective Martinez had been promoted to head a new elder crimes division, founded on principles learned from the Chen case. She regularly consulted with Margaret, bringing complex cases for review. The detective's office displayed a framed photo of Sarah's arrest, a reminder that the most dangerous predators often wore the most benevolent disguises. "You know what I remember most?" Martinez mused during one consultation. "The look on Sarah's face when she realized you'd been playing her. That moment when the predator discovered she was actually the prey. The garden, where Sarah had once made her suspicious phone calls, had been replanted. Emily's art studio now occupied the guest house, its walls covered with paintings inspired by their experience. One piece, titled "Predator's End," hung in the mansion's foyer, a stark reminder of their victory. Margaret's legacy had evolved. She was no longer just the business titan who'd built an import empire. Now she was also the woman who'd turned her own victimization into a crusade for justice, who'd transformed her pain into protection for others. As spring turned to summer, Margaret reviewed the Foundation's latest cases from her study. Each file represented another potential Sarah, another network to dismantle, another elderly victim to protect. The work was far from over, but she'd created a template for fighting back. On the 5th anniversary of Sarah's arrest, Margaret Chen stood at a podium in the newly opened Chen Center for Elder Protection. The modern building, funded by recovered assets from Sarah's criminal network, housed both the Foundation's headquarters and a training facility for law enforcement. 5 years ago, I faced a choice, Margaret addressed the gathered crowd. I could have stopped one predator, or I could help expose an entire criminal enterprise. Today, I'm proud to say that choice has helped protect thousands of vulnerable, elderly adults across the country. The statistics backed her words. The Chen Foundation had helped prosecute over 300 cases of organized elder abuse, recovered more than 200 million in stolen assets, and trained countless law enforcement officers in detecting and preventing financial exploitation. Emily, now the Foundation's executive director, sat beside her mother on the stage. Their relationship had grown stronger through their shared mission. The art gallery Emily had once dreamed of now existed, but as a therapeutic space for abuse survivors, its walls displaying works that told stories of resilience and recovery. Sarah remained in federal prison, her 30-year sentence a permanent reminder that justice could prevail. Her case had become a watershed moment in elder protection law, cited in legislation across multiple states. The Chen protocols she'd inadvertently inspired were now standard practice in financial institutions worldwide. In the audience, Detective Martinez, now Commissioner Martinez, sat with Mrs. Rivera and other key players from the original case. Their collaboration had evolved into a national network of elder protection specialists, all trained, using lessons learned from Margaret's story. "Our age is not our weakness," Margaret concluded, her voice carrying the same strength that had once commanded boardrooms and now inspired advocates. "Our experience is our armor. Our wisdom is our weapon, and to those who would prey upon us, remember, some of us have spent lifetimes outmaneuvering people far more dangerous than you." As applause filled the auditorium, Margaret looked out at the faces of other survivors, other families who'd found justice through her foundation's work. The elderly woman Sarah had mistaken for an easy target had become a symbol of resistance, her victory transforming victim into protector. The Chen family legacy had been rewritten. What began as a story of attempted exploitation had become a testament to resilience, a reminder that age brought not just vulnerability, but also the wisdom to fight back. In trying to prey upon Margaret's perceived weakness, Sarah had instead unleashed a force that would protect generations to come. Outside the center, roses from Margaret's garden bloomed in carefully tended beds, a living reminder that beauty and strength could flourish even after the darkest times. The predator's hunt had ended in justice, and Margaret Chen's final chapter had become not an ending, but a powerful new beginning.